What happens to the machines of war when the fighting stops? Where do thousands of sophisticated aircraft simply disappear to when peace arrives and nations want to forget? In the chaotic months following Germany's surrender in May 1945, one of history's most extensive and least discussed logistical operations unfolded across Europe, the systematic disappearance of the Luftwaffe. Thousands of aircraft, fighters, bombers, trainers, experimental jets, simply vanished from airfields, forests and factories across the former Reich. Some were destroyed. Others were seized by victorious powers hungry for German aviation technology. But many simply disappeared into a bureaucratic void so complete that even veteran Luftwaffe pilots, returning from prisoner of war camps years later, spoke in hushed tones about the quietest disappearance in history. This was not the dramatic destruction of military hardware that newsreels showed the world. There were no massive bonfires of aircraft, no theatrical demolitions for propaganda purposes. Instead, the Luftwaffe's dissolution happened through a combination of official Allied policy, covert technology acquisition, black market opportunism, and simple abandonment. German pilots who had flown the world's most advanced aircraft found themselves powerless witnesses to their Air Force's erasure, not through combat, but through a methodical process of confiscation, concealment, and bureaucratic oblivion that left barely a trace in the historical record. The story of the Luftwaffe's disappearance reveals how technological supremacy becomes a prize in war's aftermath, how victorious nations scramble to acquire German aviation secrets, and how an entire military force can be erased with such thoroughness that even those who served it struggled to comprehend what had happened. This is the untold story of aviation's greatest vanishing act. To understand the magnitude of the Luftwaffe's disappearance, one must first grasp the scope of what existed in May 1945. Despite Germany's defeat, despite years of Allied bombing and fuel shortages, the Luftwaffe still possessed thousands of aircraft scattered across occupied Europe. These were not relics of 1939 technology, but increasingly sophisticated machines, including jet aircraft, that represented a quantum leap beyond anything the Allies had deployed operationally. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had entered service in 1944. Though produced in limited numbers, approximately 1,400 were manufactured, it demonstrated performance characteristics that terrified Allied bomber crews. With a top speed exceeding 500 miles per hour, the Me 262 could outrun any Allied fighter and attack bomber formations with impunity. Allied intelligence desperately wanted to understand how German engineers had solved the metallurgical and aerodynamic challenges of jet propulsion years before British or American programs achieved similar results. Beyond the Me 262, German aviation had produced a menagerie of advanced designs. The Arado R-234 represented the world's first operational jet bomber. The Heinkel, a 162 Volksjäger, a lightweight jet fighter designed for mass production using semi-skilled labor and non-strategic materials, showed German desperation, but also remarkable engineering creativity. Rocket-powered aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet had achieved speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, though at terrible cost to their pilots. Numerous experimental designs existed in various stages of development: swept-wing jets, delta-wing configurations, vertical takeoff aircraft, representing research that was years ahead of Allied programs. The conventional aircraft inventory was equally significant. Despite the introduction of jets, the Luftwaffe's backbone remained propeller-driven fighters like the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109, both of which had undergone continuous development throughout the war. Later variants incorporated sophisticated features like methanol water injection for emergency power, advanced gun sights, and aerodynamic refinements that kept them competitive with Allied fighters. Bomber types ranged from the versatile Junkers Ju-88 to the heavy Heinkel He-177, each representing different design philosophies and operational concepts. But aircraft were only part of the story. The Luftwaffe had developed extensive ground infrastructure, airfields with advanced concrete runways, sophisticated repair facilities, massive underground production centers built into mountainsides to escape Allied bombing, research establishments where scientists worked on technologies that seemed like science fiction, guided missiles, infrared night vision systems, radar equipment more sophisticated than anything the Allies possessed. The personnel who operated this vast military machine represented another crucial asset. Luftwaffe pilots, mechanics, engineers, and administrators possessed years of combat experience and technical knowledge. Some pilots had flown hundreds of combat missions and survived, accumulating tactical expertise that no amount of training could replicate. Engineers understood not just how to build advanced aircraft, but why certain design approaches worked while others failed. This human capital represented knowledge that the victorious Allies wanted to acquire as thoroughly as they seized physical hardware. Germany's aviation industry had also developed organizational and production methods worth studying. Despite relentless Allied bombing, German factories had continued producing aircraft in substantial numbers until the final weeks of the war. The dispersal of production into small workshops, the use of underground facilities, the integration of forced labor, these methods revealed both German industrial capability and the depths of Nazi brutality. Understanding how Germany had sustained aircraft production under such adverse conditions offered lessons that military planners found valuable for future conflicts. The geopolitical context of May 1945 shaped how the Luftwaffe's assets would be handled. Germany had been divided into occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. This division meant that Luftwaffe aircraft and facilities fell under different jurisdictions depending on where they were located. American forces controlled southern Germany and parts of central Germany, giving them access to many BMW and Messerschmitt facilities. British forces occupied northwestern Germany, including areas where Focke-Wulf and other manufacturers operated. Soviet forces controlled eastern Germany, including significant portions of the Junkers production network. This division created immediate competition among the Allies. Each nation wanted to acquire German aviation technology before their ostensible allies could claim it. The wartime cooperation that had defeated Germany began fracturing almost immediately, with German aviation assets becoming prizes in an emerging rivalry between Western powers and the Soviet Union. What would later be called the Cold War began, in many respects, over the carcass of the Luftwaffe. The Allied policy toward German military aviation had been established during the war. The Casablanca Conference in 1943 had proclaimed that the Allies would accept nothing less than Germany's unconditional surrender. Post-surrender planning included complete disarmament and the elimination of Germany's capacity to wage war. For the Luftwaffe, this meant not just confiscating existing aircraft, but destroying Germany's aviation industry, dismantling research facilities, and preventing any resurrection of German air power. Yet competing with this policy of destruction was an equally strong impulse toward acquisition and exploitation. Allied military and intelligence services understood that German aviation technology represented the future of air warfare. Ignoring or destroying this knowledge would hand an advantage to whichever Allied nation proved most aggressive in seizing it. This tension between the official policy of eliminating German military capacity and the practical reality of wanting to exploit German technology created the conditions for the Luftwaffe's peculiar disappearance. The situation on the ground in May 1945 was chaotic. German military units were surrendering en masse, but command structures had largely collapsed. Some Luftwaffe units attempted to fly their aircraft to Western Allied zones to avoid Soviet capture. Others simply abandoned their planes where they stood and fled westward. Airfields became scenes of confusion, with Allied soldiers arriving to find hundreds of aircraft sitting unguarded, sometimes with fuel still in their tanks and ammunition still loaded. In this environment, the systematic confiscation and cataloging of Luftwaffe assets competed with simple looting, unauthorized souvenir hunting by Allied soldiers, and deliberate destruction by German personnel who preferred to wreck their aircraft rather than see them fall into enemy hands. The resulting chaos meant that comprehensive records of what aircraft existed, where they were located, and what ultimately happened to them became impossible to compile. This documentary confusion would contribute significantly to the quietest disappearance that Luftwaffe veterans would later describe. The scale of aviation infrastructure across Germany was staggering. Major production centers, like the Messerschmitt facilities at Regensburg and Augsburg, the Focke-Wulf plants at Bremen, the Junkers works at Dessau. These were not simple factories, but vast industrial complexes employing tens of thousands of workers. Underground facilities carved into mountains housed assembly lines safe from Allied bombing. Dispersed production sites scattered across the countryside attempted to distribute manufacturing to reduce vulnerability to air attack. All of this infrastructure, representing billions of Reichsmarks in investment and years of construction, suddenly became the property of occupying powers who had to decide what to preserve and what to destroy. Research facilities presented particular challenges. The Luftwaffe had sponsored extensive aerodynamic research at institutions like the German Aerospace Center and various university laboratories. Wind tunnels capable of testing models at transonic speeds, instrumentation for measuring aerodynamic forces, specialized facilities for engine testing, all represented valuable research infrastructure. The documents produced by these facilities, technical reports, test data, design studies, filled archives that Allied technical intelligence teams rushed to secure before they could be destroyed or hidden. The human dimension of this infrastructure included not just pilots and engineers, but thousands of workers who had manufactured aircraft under increasingly desperate conditions. Many were forced laborers, concentration camp inmates, prisoners of war, civilians from occupied territories compelled to work in German war industries. As Allied forces advanced, these workers were liberated, creating massive displacement and humanitarian challenges. The factories where they had labored fell silent. Assembly lines stopped mid-production, leaving partially completed aircraft that would never fly. The Luftwaffe's veterans watched their air force disappear, with emotions ranging from resignation to disbelief. For men who had served in what they considered the world's most technologically advanced air force, witnessing its dissolution carried a profound psychological weight. Understanding their perspective requires examining not just what happened to the aircraft, but what the Luftwaffe had represented to those who served it. The Luftwaffe had been reconstituted in 1935, violating the Treaty of Versailles, but reflecting Hitler's determination to rearm Germany. Unlike the Wehrmacht or Kriegsmarine, which could trace institutional continuity to Imperial German military services, the Luftwaffe was essentially a new creation, though it drew heavily on personnel who had served in covert aviation programs during the Weimar period. This newness gave the Luftwaffe a more Nazi-affiliated character than older military services. Hermann Göring, a World War I fighter ace and early Nazi supporter, led the Luftwaffe and ensured its close alignment with Nazi ideology. For young Germans in the 1930s, the Luftwaffe represented modernity, technological sophistication, and national renewal. Aviation had a romantic appeal that other military services lacked. Fighter pilots were portrayed as knights of the air, and the Luftwaffe's early victories in Spain, Poland, and France seemed to validate German technical superiority. Joining the Luftwaffe meant becoming part of something new and exciting, something that symbolized Germany's technological prowess and its rejection of the humiliating Versailles settlement. The men who flew Luftwaffe aircraft came from diverse backgrounds, but certain patterns emerged. Many officers came from middle-class families rather than the aristocratic backgrounds that traditionally supplied German military leadership. The technical nature of aviation meant that education and aptitude mattered more than social class. This created a somewhat more meritocratic culture than existed in the Wehrmacht's traditional branches, though the Luftwaffe certainly maintained its own hierarchies and prejudices. Training in the Luftwaffe had been rigorous, especially in the early war years. Pilots received extensive instruction in aerodynamics, navigation, meteorology, and tactics. Flight training emphasized not just individual skill, but formation flying and coordination with ground forces. The Luftwaffe's early doctrinal focus on supporting ground operations through close air support and interdiction meant that pilots trained to work within a combined arms framework rather than pursuing independent air strategies. The combat experience of Luftwaffe personnel by 1945 varied enormously. Some pilots had flown since the Spanish Civil War and survived nearly 8 years of combat, accumulating kill scores that dwarfed those of Allied pilots. These aces had witnessed the Luftwaffe's evolution from the confident force that had terrorized Poland and France to the desperate defensive organization struggling to protect German cities from overwhelming Allied bomber streams. They had watched friends die, seen technological advantages evaporate as Allied aircraft improved, and experienced the gradual degradation of German air power through fuel shortages and inadequate replacement aircraft. Others had joined late in the war, receiving abbreviated training as Germany's situation grew desperate. By 1944-45, Luftwaffe training had been drastically reduced due to fuel shortages and the need to rush pilots into combat. Young pilots often arrived at frontline units with minimal flying hours and no combat experience, making them easy prey for veteran Allied pilots. The casualty rates among these hastily trained pilots were horrific, and many died in their first few combat missions. Ground personnel, mechanics, armorers, radar operators, administrators, formed the vast majority of Luftwaffe strength. These men rarely received the glory accorded to pilots, but they kept the organization functioning. As the war progressed and Germany's situation deteriorated, their work became increasingly difficult. Spare parts grew scarce, forcing mechanics to cannibalize damaged aircraft to keep others flying. Fuel shortages meant that even serviceable aircraft often sat unused. The relentless Allied bombing campaign meant that airfields and maintenance facilities faced constant attack, turning routine maintenance into dangerous work performed under threat of sudden air raids. By May 1945, the Luftwaffe personnel who survived faced a disorienting transition. The organization that had structured their lives for years suddenly ceased to exist. Some found themselves in Allied prisoner of war camps. Others simply walked away from their units and tried to blend into the civilian population. Officers faced particular challenges as Allied forces detained senior Luftwaffe personnel for interrogation about technical matters and war crimes investigations. The pilots who had flown jets represented a special category. They had experienced the future of aviation, flying aircraft that performed unlike anything else in the sky. For men who had flown the Me-262, with its remarkable speed and climbing ability, returning to civilian life meant knowing they had flown technology that wouldn't become commonplace for another decade. This created a peculiar form of nostalgia, not for Nazi Germany or the war's ideology, but for the pure technological achievement of having flown the most advanced aircraft in the world. When these men later spoke about the disappearance of the Luftwaffe, they described it with an almost surreal quality. Aircraft they had flown just weeks earlier simply vanished. Airfields they knew intimately were stripped of everything valuable and left as empty concrete expanses. The massive infrastructure of the Luftwaffe, the repair depots, the training schools, the research facilities, was dismantled with such thoroughness that within months, little physical evidence remained of what had been one of the world's largest air forces. Some veterans attempted to track what happened to specific aircraft they had flown. They discovered that systematic record-keeping had largely broken down in the war's final months. Aircraft that they remembered sitting on specific airfields had disappeared without any documentation of their fate. Some had clearly been destroyed, either by retreating German forces or by Allied troops. Others had been seized by Allied technical intelligence teams and shipped to Britain, America, or the Soviet Union for evaluation. Still others simply vanished into a documentary void where their ultimate fate remained unknown. This uncertainty contributed to the sense of a quiet disappearance. If the Luftwaffe had been destroyed in some final apocalyptic battle, if its aircraft had been ceremonially demolished in public demonstrations of Allied victory, there would have been clarity and closure. Instead, the Luftwaffe simply dissolved, its aircraft scattered to unknown fates, its personnel dispersed, its institutional existence erased so thoroughly that even those who had served it struggled to reconstruct what had happened. The psychological impact of this disappearance varied among veterans. Some welcomed it, viewing the Luftwaffe's erasure as necessary for Germany's moral renewal. They wanted to forget their participation in Nazi Germany's military machine and build new lives in a democratic, peaceful Germany. For them, the Luftwaffe's quiet disappearance matched their own desire to move beyond the war. Others felt a profound sense of loss, not for Nazism, but for the professional identity and technical accomplishment that Luftwaffe service had represented. These men had been skilled professionals operating sophisticated machines, and that aspect of their experience felt separable from the regime they had served. The disappearance of the Luftwaffe meant the erasure of this professional identity, leaving a void that many struggled to fill in post-war life. A smaller group harbored resentment, feeling that Allied treatment of the Luftwaffe amounted to theft of German technological achievement. They viewed the systematic confiscation of aircraft and technical data as victor's justice taken to extremes, depriving Germany not just of military power, but of industrial and scientific capacity that rightfully belonged to the German nation. This resentment would contribute to later controversies about German scientists and engineers recruited by Allied powers during Operation Paperclip and similar programs. The silence surrounding the Luftwaffe's disappearance also reflected broader German society's desire to avoid confronting the recent past. In the immediate post-war years, Germans focused on survival, finding food, rebuilding destroyed cities, establishing new political systems under Allied occupation. Questions about what happened to thousands of military aircraft seemed trivial compared to these pressing concerns. Later, as Germany began economic recovery in the 1950s, there remained little appetite for dwelling on military matters that reminded Germans of the catastrophe the war had brought. Consequently, the story of the Luftwaffe's disappearance remained largely untold for decades. Veterans occasionally shared memories among themselves, but public discussion was minimal. The few books published about the Luftwaffe in the 1950s and 1960s focused on combat narratives or technical descriptions of aircraft, not on the Air Force's dissolution. The massive Allied operation to seize and evaluate German aviation technology received some coverage in Western countries, but the German perspective, the view of those who watched their Air Force vanish, remained largely unexplored. The cultural impact of the Luftwaffe's disappearance on German society was subtle but significant. Aviation had been a source of national pride in the 1930s, with Lufthansa flying modern airliners and German pilots setting records that captured international attention. The Luftwaffe's formation had seemed to validate Germany's technological sophistication and modernity. Its disappearance thus represented not just military defeat, but the collapse of a cultural narrative about German technical excellence and national renewal. For the generation that had served in the Luftwaffe, this collapse created identity challenges that extended for decades. In a society eager to move past militarism, acknowledging Luftwaffe service became socially complicated. Some veterans simply never discussed their wartime experiences with children or grandchildren. Others framed their service in purely technical terms, emphasizing flying skills or engineering work while minimizing the military context. Still others found community in veterans organizations where they could discuss experiences with others who understood, creating insular social networks where memories of the Luftwaffe could be preserved without broader social judgment. The international dimension of veterans' experiences also deserves attention. Luftwaffe personnel who ended up working for Allied aviation programs faced particularly complex social situations. They had fought against the nations they now served, and their colleagues often included men who had fought against Germany. Some adapted remarkably well, finding that shared technical interests bridged national and political divides. Others remained perpetual outsiders, tolerated for their expertise, but never fully accepted by colleagues who remembered them as former enemies. The disappearance of the Luftwaffe after World War II illuminates several profound themes about technology, power, and historical memory. At its heart lies a fundamental question: what happens to military technology when it becomes simultaneously obsolete and invaluable? The Luftwaffe's aircraft were obsolete in the sense that Germany had lost the war and could no longer use them for their intended purpose. Yet they were invaluable as repositories of technical knowledge that could accelerate Allied aviation programs and provide insights into the future of air warfare. This paradox drove much of what happened in 1945 and beyond. Allied technical intelligence teams descended on Germany with clear priorities: identify advanced technology, evaluate it, seize it, and prevent competitors from acquiring it. The competition was both international, preventing rival Allied nations from gaining advantages, and ideological, as Western powers and the Soviet Union increasingly viewed each other as potential adversaries rather than allies. The systematic nature of Allied technical intelligence operations was remarkable. Teams of specialists arrived with detailed target lists compiled from wartime intelligence, prisoner interrogations, and captured documents. They knew which facilities to prioritize, which engineers to locate, which aircraft represented the most significant technical advances. This was not random looting, but organized exploitation of German technical knowledge. Operation Lusty, the acronym stood for Luftwaffe Secret Technology, represented the American effort. Teams fanned out across the American occupation zone, identifying aircraft and aviation equipment worth shipping to the United States for detailed evaluation. The British mounted similar operations, as did the French and Soviets. Each nation competed to acquire the best examples of German technology before their allies could claim them. The Me-262 jet fighter became a particular prize. The Americans eventually shipped numerous examples to the United States, where they were exhaustively tested at Wright Field in Ohio. Test pilots flew captured Me-262s extensively, evaluating their performance characteristics and identifying both strengths and weaknesses. The data gathered informed American jet development, accelerating programs that might otherwise have taken years longer to mature. British technical intelligence focused heavily on jet engines and aerodynamic research. German engineers had developed axial flow jet engines that were more efficient than the centrifugal designs the British had pioneered. Capturing these engines and the engineers who designed them provided British industry with knowledge that influenced the next generation of British jets. Similarly, German research into swept wings and delta configurations offered insights that shaped British and American aircraft designs in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The Soviet Union's approach was perhaps the most comprehensive. Soviet forces occupied much of eastern Germany, including significant portions of the aviation industry. Rather than simply shipping selected examples back to the Soviet Union, the Soviets in some cases dismantled entire factories, crating up machine tools, technical drawings, and even coercing German engineers to relocate to the Soviet Union. This wholesale transfer of industrial capacity reflected Soviet determination to rapidly close the technological gap with Western powers. But beyond this official, organized exploitation lay a vast gray area where aircraft disappeared through less systematic means. Allied soldiers took souvenirs, propellers, instruments, pieces of aircraft skin bearing swastikas. Officers sometimes claimed entire aircraft as personal trophies, though most lacked the means to actually take them home. Local populations scavenged crashed aircraft for metal that could be sold or repurposed. Black market operators acquired aircraft components that might have value to collectors or could be melted down for raw materials. The destruction of aircraft also proceeded through multiple channels. Some German units, following orders or acting on their own initiative, destroyed their aircraft before surrendering to prevent Allied use. They removed engines, punctured fuel tanks, or simply set aircraft ablaze. Allied forces also destroyed aircraft deemed not worth shipping for evaluation, either because they represented obsolete types or because logistics prevented their preservation. Thousands of aircraft were simply bulldozed into pits and buried, a pragmatic solution to the problem of disposing of unwanted materiel. This combination of systematic seizure, unsystematic looting, and outright destruction meant that comprehensive accounting became impossible. Records that might have documented Luftwaffe aircraft inventories had been destroyed, lost, or captured in the war's chaos. Even when records existed, the situation on the ground often differed from paper-strength returns. Aircraft listed as operational might have been wrecks. Units shown on organizational charts might have ceased to exist weeks earlier. The silence that Luftwaffe veterans noted stemmed partly from this documentary chaos, but also from deliberate decisions to minimize publicity around Allied technical exploitation. Western governments did not want to advertise how extensively they were benefiting from German technology, partly because this might undermine narratives about Allied technical superiority, and partly because details of German advances might alarm civilian populations already anxious about the emerging Cold War. The Soviet Union, for its part, had ideological reasons to downplay German influence on Soviet aviation. Soviet propaganda emphasized native Soviet technical achievement, and acknowledging extensive copying of German designs contradicted this narrative. Consequently, Soviet use of German technology remained classified for decades, revealed only gradually as archives opened after the Cold War's end. For the Germans who had designed and built these aircraft, the disappearance represented both loss and opportunity. Some engineers and scientists ended up working for Allied aviation programs, either voluntarily or under various degrees of coercion. The American Operation Paperclip brought hundreds of German specialists to the United States, where they contributed to aviation, rocketry, and other technical fields. The Soviets similarly employed German experts, though often under less generous terms. These technical specialists faced moral and practical dilemmas. Working for former enemies meant helping nations that had bombed German cities and occupied their country. Yet for many, continuing their professional work seemed preferable to unemployment or forced labor clearing rubble. Some rationalized that their work had been scientific rather than political, that aerodynamics and jet propulsion were politically neutral fields. Others acknowledged their complicity in Nazi militarism, but argued that they could only influence the future, not change the past. The aircraft themselves, scattered across Allied testing facilities and museums, became physical embodiments of a vanished organization. HMA 262 at the Smithsonian represents not just a technological artifact, but the residue of a military force that briefly operated the most advanced aircraft in the world before being comprehensively defeated and systematically dismantled. These preserved aircraft are survivors of a deliberate erasure, their presence in museums owing to chance decisions about which examples to preserve rather than any systematic effort to document the Luftwaffe's final inventory. The theme of technological transfer also raises questions about how knowledge moves between nations and systems. The Luftwaffe's disappearance was simultaneously a destruction and a dispersal. German aviation technology did not simply cease to exist. It was absorbed into Allied programs, where it influenced the next generation of aircraft. The swept wings of the F-86 Sabre that fought in Korea, the jet engines that powered early British jets, the delta wing configurations explored in experimental aircraft, all bore German influences, knowledge transferred not through scientific exchange, but through military conquest. This pattern of technology transfer through defeat has historical precedents and successors. After World War I, Germany had absorbed lessons from Allied aircraft and adapted them to German designs during the interwar period. After World War II, both the United States and Soviet Union would transfer aerospace knowledge to client states or incorporate insights from each other's programs through espionage. The Luftwaffe's disappearance represented a particularly dramatic instance of this broader pattern, where military defeat becomes the mechanism for technological diffusion. The quietness of the disappearance, the lack of public spectacle or official ceremony, reflects a peculiar aspect of how nations handle defeated enemies' military assets. Unlike ancient conquerors who might display captured weapons as trophies, or unlike the very public trials of Nazi leaders at Nuremberg, the handling of Luftwaffe aircraft proceeded quietly, almost furtively. This reflected pragmatic concerns about not revealing to potential adversaries exactly what technology had been acquired, but it also created the documentary void that has made reconstructing the full story so difficult. The economic dimension of the Luftwaffe's disappearance also warrants examination. German aviation represented substantial economic value, not just completed aircraft but production machinery, raw materials, partially completed assemblies, and specialized tools. Allied authorities had to decide how to handle these economic assets. Some factories were dismantled and shipped to Allied nations as reparations. Others were destroyed to eliminate German industrial capacity. Still others were preserved and eventually returned to German control as occupation policies evolved. The destruction of German aviation industry had long-term economic consequences for Germany. The prohibition against German aircraft production, initially intended to be permanent, eliminated an entire industrial sector. Skilled workers found themselves unemployed, their expertise irrelevant in a nation forbidden to build aircraft. Companies that had been major employers disappeared or pivoted to entirely different products. This economic disruption contributed to post-war German unemployment and complicated reconstruction efforts. Yet this same disruption created opportunities. Some former aviation engineers applied their skills to automotive industry, helping develop vehicles like the Volkswagen Beetle. Others worked in civil engineering, using their understanding of structures and materials to rebuild German cities. The dispersal of aviation talent into other sectors arguably contributed to Germany's broader post-war economic success, as technically skilled workers brought systematic problem-solving approaches to diverse industries. The environmental legacy of the Luftwaffe's disappearance remains visible in some locations. Abandoned airfields became industrial sites or housing developments, their concrete runways repurposed or broken up. Underground production facilities were sealed or converted to other uses. Crash sites where aircraft had been abandoned or destroyed sometimes remained untouched for decades, becoming informal memorials or archaeological sites where enthusiasts excavated corroded components. Understanding what actually happened to Luftwaffe aircraft requires piecing together fragmentary evidence from multiple sources. Allied technical intelligence reports, German aviation industry records, post-war interrogations of Luftwaffe personnel, and the physical aircraft that survive in museums together paint a partial picture of the Luftwaffe's fate. The most significant category was aircraft seized for technical evaluation. The Americans alone shipped approximately 200 German aircraft to the United States for testing, including multiple examples of jets like the Me-262 and R-234, advanced piston engine fighters, and experimental types. These aircraft underwent extensive testing at facilities like Wright Field in Ohio, where Allied test pilots flew them to evaluate performance and identify design features worth incorporating into Allied aircraft. Testing revealed both strengths and weaknesses of German designs. The Me-262's speed and firepower impressed American pilots, but they also noted the aircraft's poor low-speed handling and the unreliability of its engines, which required rebuilding after just 10 to 25 hours of operation. The Focke-Wulf Tu-152, a high-altitude fighter, demonstrated excellent performance but arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. Experimental swept-wing designs showed promise, but also revealed the aerodynamic challenges that German engineers had not fully solved. British evaluation efforts focused particularly on jet engines and high-speed aerodynamics. German axial flow jet engines, while less reliable than British centrifugal designs, offered better efficiency and the potential for higher thrust. British engineers studied captured German engines intensively, and this knowledge influenced the development of British jets in the late 1940s. Wind tunnel data from German research facilities provided insights into transonic and supersonic aerodynamics that accelerated British and American research programs. The Soviet acquisition effort was massive in scale, if not always in sophistication. Soviet forces captured substantial portions of the Junkers and Heinkel production facilities, along with design bureaus and research institutes. Rather than just taking selected aircraft, the Soviets dismantled factories and transported entire production lines to the Soviet Union. German engineers and technicians were sometimes coerced into relocating to Soviet facilities, where they worked on developing Soviet versions of German aircraft or helped create entirely new designs incorporating German technology. This wholesale technology transfer had lasting effects on Soviet aviation. The MiG-15, the Soviet jet fighter that shocked Western powers when it appeared over Korea in 1950, used an engine based on British designs but incorporated aerodynamic lessons from German research. Soviet bomber programs similarly showed German influence, particularly in understanding long-range navigation and high-altitude flight. The Soviet aerospace program's rapid advancement in the late 1940s owed significant debts to acquired German technology, though Soviet propaganda rarely acknowledged this. French acquisition efforts, while smaller in scale than American, British, or Soviet operations, still resulted in numerous German aircraft and components being transported to France. Some German engineers ended up working in French aviation, contributing to post-war French aircraft development. The French industry, devastated by 4 years of occupation, benefited from access to German technology and expertise that helped rebuild French aviation capability. Beyond systematic Allied acquisition, substantial numbers of aircraft were simply destroyed. German personnel destroyed some before surrender, particularly elite units that preferred wrecking their aircraft to seeing them captured. Allied forces destroyed others deemed worthless for evaluation or too damaged to justify preservation. Thousands of aircraft were bulldozed into pits, burned, or cut up for scrap metal. The logistics of this destruction were considerable. A single-engine fighter might weigh several tons and contain substantial amounts of aluminum, steel, and other materials. Destroying thousands of such aircraft required equipment, labor, and time. Allied forces, eager to demobilize and reduce occupation costs, wanted to dispose of German military equipment quickly. Mass destruction provided the most efficient solution, even if it obliterated artifacts that might have had historical or technical value. Some aircraft survived through chance or individual initiative. Allied soldiers occasionally preserved aircraft as war trophies, though most lacked means to transport them home. A few aircraft ended up in private hands through unclear circumstances, possibly acquired from occupation authorities or simply claimed from abandoned airfields. These privately held aircraft sometimes surfaced decades later when owners attempted to sell them or donate them to museums. Museums became repositories for some examples, though systematic museum collection of Luftwaffe aircraft began surprisingly late. In the immediate post-war years, little interest existed in preserving German military equipment for historical purposes. Only gradually did museums recognize the value of documenting German aviation history. By then, many aircraft had already been destroyed, and those that survived often existed only because they had been set aside for technical evaluation rather than deliberately preserved for historical reasons. The paper trail documenting individual aircraft often runs cold in 1945 or shortly thereafter. An aircraft might be documented in a Luftwaffe strength return from April 1945, then appear on an Allied capture list, then vanish from records entirely. Whether it was shipped for evaluation, destroyed, or met some other fate often remains unknown. This documentary frustration reflects the chaos of Germany's collapse and the priorities of occupation forces focused on immediate security concerns rather than detailed record-keeping. Reconstruction of the Luftwaffe's final strength involves educated guesswork informed by fragmentary evidence. Production records show how many aircraft were manufactured, but these numbers don't account for combat losses, accidents, or aircraft destroyed before surrender. Allied strength estimates from intelligence reports provide another data point, but wartime intelligence was imperfect and sometimes contradictory. Post-war interrogations of Luftwaffe personnel yielded additional information, though memories were fallible and some information was deliberately withheld. The best current estimates suggest that the Luftwaffe possessed approximately 10,000 aircraft of all types in early May 1945, though perhaps only half were operational. These were dispersed across Germany and occupied territories, hidden in forests, concealed in underground facilities, or sitting abandoned on airfields. Within 6 months, the vast majority had been destroyed, shipped to Allied countries for evaluation, or cannibalized for parts. Within a few years, little remained beyond the few hundred examples preserved in museums or Allied test facilities. The technology itself, the knowledge embodied in these aircraft, proved harder to destroy than the physical machines. German engineers carried knowledge in their heads that could be transferred to new employers. Technical documents, though many were destroyed or lost, survived in sufficient quantities to inform Allied programs. The physical aircraft that were tested yielded data that informed the next generation of Allied designs. In this sense, the Luftwaffe did not entirely disappear but was absorbed and transformed, its technology living on in the aircraft that followed. The specific fates of certain notable aircraft illustrate the broader pattern. The White 7, AME-262, flown by Adolf Galland, was captured by American forces and eventually shipped to the United States. After testing, it ended up at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, where it remains on display. The Black 10, another Me-262, was captured by British forces and tested at Farnborough, before being preserved at the RAF Museum. These specific aircraft survived because they represented important examples of advanced technology that Allied air forces wanted to study in detail. Other aircraft disappeared without trace. Production records show that certain experimental types were built. Photographs document their existence, but their ultimate fate remains unknown. Were they destroyed by retreating German forces, captured and later scrapped after evaluation, hidden and gradually deteriorated until nothing remained? The answers are lost to history, victims of the documentary chaos that characterized Germany's collapse. The human stories behind specific aircraft sometimes emerge decades later. Veterans occasionally reconnected with aircraft they had flown, discovering them in museums or private collections. These reunions could be emotional, as elderly men encountered machines they had last seen as young pilots in desperate combat situations. Some museums facilitated these connections, inviting veterans to share memories and provide context for displayed aircraft. These oral histories became valuable historical resources, capturing perspectives that written records had missed. Archaeological efforts have occasionally recovered aircraft that had been abandoned or crashed in remote locations. Peat bogs in northern Germany and lakes in various locations have yielded remarkably well-preserved aircraft, their aluminum structures protected from corrosion by anaerobic conditions. These discoveries sometimes revealed aircraft that records suggested had been destroyed, adding data points to historical understanding while demonstrating how incomplete documentary evidence remains. The restoration of surviving aircraft has become a specialized field, with experts reconstructing deteriorated examples for museum display or occasionally for return to flying condition. These restoration projects face challenges ranging from corroded aluminum structures to missing components that must be fabricated from original technical drawings. The work requires balancing historical authenticity with practical concerns like safety and parts availability. Some restorations have sparked controversy when modern materials or techniques are used instead of original methods, with purists arguing that this compromises historical integrity. The story of the Luftwaffe's disappearance raises profound questions about technology, memory, and how societies handle the remnants of defeated enemies. The quietness that Luftwaffe veterans noted was not accidental, but reflected deliberate choices by both Allied authorities and German society about what to remember and what to forget. For Allied nations, particularly the United States and Britain, there existed a tension between celebrating victory and acknowledging the extent to which German technology had surpassed Allied efforts in certain areas. Public narratives emphasized Allied technical and industrial superiority, the overwhelming production of American factories, the sophistication of British radar, and code breaking. Acknowledging that Germany had developed operational jet fighters while Allied jets remained experimental, or that German aerodynamic research was years ahead of Allied programs, complicated these narratives. The solution was selective silence. Allied governments publicized captured German equipment in ways that emphasized Allied triumph, while downplaying how advanced some German systems were. Newsreels showed warehouses full of captured equipment, but rarely explained that Allied engineers were feverishly studying this equipment to understand how it worked. Technical intelligence reports remained classified for decades, their contents known only to specialists who incorporated German insights into Allied programs without public acknowledgement of their origins. This selective disclosure created distorted historical understanding. For decades, popular histories portrayed World War II aviation as a story of progressive Allied technical advantage, with German desperation producing exotic but ultimately ineffective weapons. Only gradually, as archives opened and technical intelligence reports were declassified, did a more nuanced picture emerge. German aviation had achieved remarkable advances in some areas, and Allied victory owed more to overwhelming industrial capacity and operational competence than to across-the-board technical superiority. The Soviet approach involved even more comprehensive silence. Soviet ideology emphasized socialist superiority over capitalist systems, making it ideologically uncomfortable to acknowledge extensive copying of German capitalist technology. Consequently, Soviet use of German aviation technology remained classified for decades. When Soviet aircraft incorporating German influences appeared, official histories attributed advances to Soviet engineering genius rather than acquired knowledge. For Germany, the silence served different purposes. Post-war German society wanted to distance itself from Nazi militarism and focus on democratic reconstruction. Dwelling on military matters seemed contrary to building a peaceful, democratic Germany. Moreover, many Germans felt shame about the war and the crimes committed in Germany's name. The Luftwaffe, while less directly implicated in atrocities than some military and paramilitary organizations, still represented Nazi Germany's military power. Its erasure felt appropriate to a nation seeking redemption. This silence had costs. Historical understanding suffered when those with first-hand knowledge avoided discussing their experiences. Technical knowledge was lost when engineers and pilots died without recording their insights. The full scope of what happened, how many aircraft existed, where they went, what was learned from them, became increasingly difficult to reconstruct as witnesses aged and documents were lost. The ethical dimensions of technology transfer also merit examination. German engineers who worked on advanced aircraft often contributed to the Nazi war effort knowingly and sometimes enthusiastically. Some held Nazi party membership. Many benefited from forced labor in aircraft factories, where concentration camp inmates and other coerced workers assembled aircraft under brutal conditions. When Allied nations recruited these engineers, they acquired not just technical knowledge, but individuals with varying degrees of moral complicity in Nazi crimes. Operation Paperclip, which brought German scientists and engineers to the United States, remains controversial precisely because of these ethical complexities. American authorities sometimes downplayed or ignored recruits' Nazi affiliations, prioritizing technical expertise over moral considerations. Similar programs in Britain, France, and the Soviet Union raised comparable ethical questions. The defense was that technical knowledge was politically neutral, that scientists and engineers were not primarily responsible for how their work was used. Critics argued that this rationalization ignored the reality that these individuals had chosen to serve a criminal regime. The Luftwaffe veterans' description of their Air Force's disappearance as the quietest in history reflected their peripheral role in determining what happened to their organization. Unlike the deliberate dissolution of military forces through treaty or negotiation, where defeated parties might have some voice, the Luftwaffe's fate was determined entirely by victors pursuing their own interests. German personnel could only watch as Allied authorities decided which aircraft to preserve, which to test, which to destroy, and which technologies to exploit. This powerlessness extended to historical narrative. For decades after the war, histories of the Luftwaffe were written primarily by Allied authors, often based on captured documents and interrogations, but rarely incorporating German perspectives in depth. German veterans who might have provided insights often remained silent, either from disinterest in revisiting painful memories or from concern that discussing their military service might revive unwelcome questions about their wartime activities. Comparing the Luftwaffe's disappearance to other historical instances of military dissolution illuminates unique aspects. After World War I, German military forces were reduced through treaty provisions that Germany negotiated, however unwillingly. The process involved German participation and left institutional continuity, allowing knowledge and traditions to be preserved. After World War II, no such continuity existed. The Luftwaffe was not reduced, but eliminated. Its institutional existence terminated absolutely. The Japanese military experienced similar elimination after 1945, but with differences. Japan's geographic separation meant that technology transfer required different logistics. Japanese aircraft technology, while impressive in some respects, generally lagged behind German advances, making it less attractive to Allied powers. Consequently, fewer Japanese aircraft were preserved for detailed study, and the technology transfer was less extensive than from Germany. The long-term consequences of the Luftwaffe's disappearance extended beyond immediate post-war years. The Korean War saw aircraft whose designs incorporated German influences facing each other in combat. The F-86 Sabre, with its swept wings influenced by German research, fought the MiG-15, powered by engines developed with German assistance and incorporating German aerodynamic insights. In this sense, the technological legacy of the Luftwaffe lived on through its influence on both sides of the Cold War divide. The museums that eventually acquired surviving Luftwaffe aircraft faced their own ethical and practical dilemmas. How should they present these artifacts? Emphasizing technical achievement risked appearing to celebrate Nazi engineering without acknowledging the regime's criminality. Focusing entirely on Nazi crimes risked ignoring the genuine technical innovations these aircraft represented. Most museums attempted balance, discussing technical aspects while contextualizing aircraft within the broader history of Nazi Germany and World War II. Restoration of surviving aircraft has sometimes proved controversial. Resources invested in restoring a Me-262 to flight status might be seen as glorifying Nazi technology rather than preserving history. Defenders argue that flying aircraft provides insights impossible to gain from static displays, that seeing a jet fighter from 1945 actually fly demonstrates the remarkable achievement it represented. These debates reflect ongoing tensions about how to remember morally compromised technological achievement. The international dynamics of technology acquisition created lasting effects on Cold War military balance. The fact that both the United States and Soviet Union acquired substantial German aviation technology meant that both sides benefited roughly equally, preventing either from gaining decisive advantage. Had one side monopolized German technology while denying it to the other, the Cold War's military balance might have developed very differently. In this sense, the distributed nature of the Luftwaffe's disappearance, with different Allied powers acquiring different portions, helped maintain strategic stability even as it contributed to the arms race. The role of individual decisions in determining which aircraft survived deserves attention. A test pilot's interest in a particular aircraft type, a curator's appreciation for historical significance, an engineer's recognition that specific technology warranted detailed study, these individual judgments determined which aircraft were preserved and which were destroyed. There was no master plan ensuring representative preservation. Consequently, Some historically significant types disappeared entirely, while less important variants survived by chance. The economic motivations behind technology acquisition also shaped outcomes. German machine tools and production equipment had commercial value beyond military applications. Some Allied companies acquired German manufacturing technology, not primarily for weapons development, but to improve their commercial aviation or general manufacturing capabilities. This commercial dimension of technology transfer operated alongside military acquisition, creating complex webs of corporate and government interests that influenced which technologies were pursued and how acquired knowledge was exploited. The disappearance of the Luftwaffe after World War II represents one of history's most extensive yet least discussed military dissolutions. Within months of Germany's surrender, an air force that had fielded thousands of aircraft and pioneered jet aviation ceased to exist. Its aircraft were scattered to testing facilities, museums, and scrapyards across the globe. Its personnel dispersed into civilian life, prisoner of war camps, or service with former enemies. Its institutional knowledge was extracted through interrogations, captured documents, and recruitment of engineers who had designed its most advanced systems. The quietness that Luftwaffe veterans noted reflected multiple factors. Allied authorities had pragmatic and political reasons to minimize publicity around German technology acquisition. German society wanted to move beyond military matters and focus on democratic reconstruction. The Cold War's emergence meant that some aspects of technology transfer became classified, preventing public discussion. Documentary chaos from Germany's collapse meant that comprehensive records never existed for historians to analyze. Reconstructing what happened requires assembling fragmentary evidence from diverse sources. Allied technical intelligence reports, now largely declassified, reveal the systematic evaluation of German aircraft and technology. German aviation industry records, though incomplete, document production and development. Surviving aircraft in museums provide physical evidence of designs and capabilities. Memoirs and interviews with participants on all sides offer personal perspectives, though colored by time and individual bias. The picture that emerges shows the Luftwaffe's disappearance as neither simple destruction nor simple preservation, but a complex process of selective acquisition, widespread destruction, and extensive technology transfer. The most advanced aircraft, jets, rockets, experimental designs, received careful evaluation, with examples shipped to Allied countries for detailed testing. Conventional types deemed technically uninteresting were typically destroyed. Aircraft in Soviet-occupied zones faced different fates, with some preserved for evaluation, but many simply left to rust as the Soviet Union focused on dismantling factory equipment rather than preserving individual aircraft. The technology transfer that accompanied the Luftwaffe's physical disappearance had lasting effects. German aerodynamic research influenced the next generation of Allied aircraft. German jet engine designs informed British and American propulsion programs. German experience with high-speed flight and swept-wing configurations accelerated Allied understanding of transonic and supersonic aerodynamics. The Korean War would be fought partly with aircraft whose designs owed debts to German research, though these connections were rarely acknowledged publicly. For the men who had served in the Luftwaffe, the disappearance carried profound psychological weight. Their professional identity had been tied to an organization that suddenly ceased to exist. Aircraft they had flown, facilities they had worked in, the entire institutional framework that had structured their lives, all vanished with remarkable completeness. Some adapted readily to civilian life, viewing the Luftwaffe's end as a necessary break with a shameful past. Others struggled with loss of purpose and identity, finding post-war civilian life unfulfilling compared to the intensity of military service. The engineers and scientists who had designed Luftwaffe aircraft faced particularly complex transitions. Their skills remained valuable, and Allied nations competed to recruit them. Some accepted positions with former enemies and contributed to aviation programs in America, Britain, or the Soviet Union. Others remained in Germany and helped rebuild German aviation industry under Allied supervision. Their choices involved moral compromises, as continuing technical work meant serving nations that had defeated Germany, while refusing could mean unemployment or forced labor in difficult conditions. The historical memory of the Luftwaffe remains contested. For some, it represents technological achievement separable from the Nazi regime it served. For others, Luftwaffe accomplishments cannot be divorced from the criminal regime that created and employed the Air Force. Museums displaying Luftwaffe aircraft navigate these tensions, trying to acknowledge technical innovation while contextualizing it within the broader history of Nazi Germany. The quietest disappearance in aviation history was quiet not from lack of activity, but from deliberate choices about what to remember and what to forget. Allied nations wanted German technology, but not public acknowledgement of how extensively they relied on it. German society wanted to move beyond militarism, but this required suppressing detailed discussion of military history. The result was a historical gap where one of the world's most advanced air forces simply vanished from documented history, leaving only fragments for later historians to reassemble. Today, the surviving aircraft in museums stand as physical remnants of this disappeared force. A Me-262 at the Smithsonian, a WW190 at the RAF Museum, the scattered examples in collections worldwide, these are survivors of a systematic erasure. Their presence owes to chance decisions about which examples to preserve, rather than any comprehensive effort to document the Luftwaffe's final strength. They represent perhaps 1% of the aircraft that existed in May 1945, the tiny fraction that escaped destruction or abandonment. The technology embodied in these aircraft lives on more substantially than the physical machines. Modern jet aircraft descend in part from German pioneers who first solved the challenges of jet propulsion and high-speed flight. The knowledge gained from studying captured Luftwaffe aircraft accelerated Allied aviation programs and influenced designs that would dominate the skies for decades. In this sense, the Luftwaffe did not entirely disappear but was absorbed and transformed, its innovations becoming part of the broader stream of aviation development. The veterans who described their Air Force's disappearance as the quietest in history were not entirely correct. The Luftwaffe's end involved massive activity: aircraft seized, factories dismantled, personnel interrogated, technology transferred. But it was quiet in the sense that these activities proceeded without public ceremony or historical documentation. No official records chronicled the final disposition of thousands of aircraft. No comprehensive history was written documenting the Luftwaffe's dissolution. The process happened in bureaucratic obscurity, carried out by military and intelligence personnel focused on immediate tasks rather than historical preservation. 75 years later, historians continue uncovering new details about the Luftwaffe's end. Declassified documents reveal previously unknown aspects of Allied technical intelligence operations. Archaeological investigations sometimes discover crashed or buried aircraft whose fates had been unknown. Surviving participants occasionally share memories that add details to the historical record, yet significant gaps remain, questions that may never be answered about specific aircraft, personnel, or facilities. The story of the Luftwaffe's disappearance ultimately reveals how military technology becomes both trophy and tool in war's aftermath. Victorious nations seized German aviation technology not from pure scientific curiosity, but from recognition that this knowledge conferred competitive advantages. The systematic exploitation of German technical expertise accelerated Allied aviation programs and contributed to Cold War military capabilities. The physical aircraft were valuable primarily as repositories of knowledge that could be extracted through testing and interrogation. For those who witnessed it, the Luftwaffe's disappearance represented the total defeat and dissolution of an organization that had once seemed invincible. The speed and thoroughness of this erasure, from operational air force to scattered museum pieces in a matter of months, demonstrated the completeness of Germany's defeat. Nothing remained. The institutional continuity had been severed. The knowledge had been extracted and transferred. The physical infrastructure had been destroyed or repurposed. What had been one of the world's most formidable air forces was reduced to historical memory and a few surviving artifacts. The quietness persists. Unlike other aspects of World War II that receive extensive attention, the Luftwaffe's end remains a relatively obscure topic, known primarily to aviation historians and enthusiasts. Popular histories mention it briefly, if at all, focusing instead on combat operations or specific aircraft types. The systematic Allied effort to acquire and exploit German technology receives less attention than other aspects of post-war Germany. The result is a historical blind spot, where a massive logistical and intelligence operation simply disappears from collective memory. Perhaps this quietness is fitting. The Luftwaffe represented Nazi Germany's aerial power and its disappearance marked the end of Nazi military capability. A quiet erasure suits an organization that served a regime whose complete defeat and delegitimization remains one of history's few unambiguous moral judgments. Yet the quietness also obscures important history about technology transfer, military dissolution, and how victorious powers handled defeated enemies' assets. The Luftwaffe's disappearance deserves to be remembered not to glorify Nazi aviation, but to understand how military power is unmade, and how knowledge moves between nations through conquest rather than cooperation. The veterans who called it the quietest disappearance in history spoke from experience of watching something massive vanish almost without trace. They were correct that the scale of what disappeared, thousands of aircraft, entire factory systems, vast institutional knowledge, contrasted dramatically with the minimal documentation of where it all went. Their observation captures a historical truth. Sometimes the most significant events proceed quietly, leaving gaps in the record that challenge later attempts at historical reconstruction. The Luftwaffe's end was such an event, massive in scope, consequential in effects, yet quiet enough that much of what happened remains unknown.